We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
What goes through your mind when you read those words to the preamble?
Chills up and down my back. I mean, it moves me deeply that these men, in creating this document, which is shall I say, the instrument of government, thought of these purposes, even though they thought of them late in the course of the day. They thought of these purposes as the ends to be served by the instrument they had created.
And we're still not there.
We're still not there by far.
At the age of 85, Mortimer Adler has been many things: philosopher, author, editor, one of America's best-known entrepreneurs of
Do you
ideas.
think the General Welfare Clause includes equality?
I think it can be argued that, or perhaps
How would you
common-
do that?
But first
How
and
can you do that?
foremost, Mortimer Adler is
Oh,
a
you think
teacher,
we have
demanding of his
internal
students
unity
the hard
is
thought
due to
he
our
says
sense of
democracy
reacting against
demands of its
outside
citizens.
forces.
There's certainly some of that. It's not everything.
His
but-
favorite subject this year is the United States Constitution. Adler has written a book, his 40th, called We Hold These Truths, Understanding the Ideas and Ideals of the Constitution.
Southern states, by seceding, were breaking the Constitution, and that very act was unconstitutional.
And in this program, he will discuss the Constitution with students of St. John's College in Maryland.
We're talking about the blessing. How far should liberty go? What are the blessings of liberty?
Mortimer Adler will teach, and in turn will be taught a thing or two.
I must say, I may be wrong about that. I took that position in the book, and I've listened to your argument. Maybe that should be revised. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
It is 200 years old.
One country, one constitution, one destiny.
We have revered and debated it.
Like the Bible, it ought to be read again and
The people
again.
made the Constitution, and the people can unmake it.
We have honored and criticized it.
My faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete.
The prejudices of the day are called constitutional law.
We even fought a bloody civil war over
This
it.
covenant with death, this agreement with hell, this refuge of lies.
But we have lived with it. We are still living with it today, still debating it, still in search of the Constitution.
I'm Bill Moyers in the library of one of America's first schools, St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, with roots that go back all the way to our revolutionary past. Patriots gathered under the school's Liberty Tree to hear orators cry for freedom. 4 of the college founders signed the Declaration of Independence. The French camped here en route to help George Washington defeat the British at Yorktown, and some of the fallen French soldiers are buried on the college grounds in unmarked graves. St. John's is a fitting place to explore the history and meaning of the American Constitution. Ideas are the life source of this place. They emerge in the give and take of seminars, students and teachers sharing an equality of conversation. They read and discuss classical works of science, philosophy, and literature, and they use original texts such as the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Mortimer Adler and the late Robert Hutchins pioneered the curriculum based on the great books, and Adler has long been a familiar and frequent visitor to these halls.
What's unique about St. John's is the 2 things. The absolutely required program, no electives, and every member of the faculty must teach the whole program. There are no professors in this college and no departments. There's only one title. Everyone has the same title, fellow and tutor of the college. And every member of the faculty teaches the whole program.
And the whole program is
Great book seminars, Tuesday and Thursday night, one formal lecture a week on Friday night for the whole college, and 3 tutorials in mathematics, in language, and in Latin science.
really the classics. Adler's annual lecture is a tradition on campus, and so is the annual prank played on him by the senior class.
I wish to thank the senior class for honoring the seriousness of this occasion in our country's bicentennial by foregoing the traditional Adler prank. In 1938, in the Great Hall, I started at 8:15 as usual, and at 9:15, every alarm clock in the college went off in the balcony. I paused until they stopped and continued the lecture. In 1939, they thought they could stop me. Again, I started at 8:15. At 9:15, someone pulled the main switch, and the room was in complete darkness. But I took some matches out of my pocket and continued the lecture. And since then, every year we've had an Adler prank, and some have been quite marvelous, and others pretty good. The bicentennial, celebrated by the United States of America in 1976, was the 200th anniversary of its Declaration of Independence, but it certainly was not the bicentennial of the nation the world knows by that name today. And if you really want, I think, the birth date, the birth of this nation, the date when it actually came into being, it is the day that Washington took the oath of office, I think March 9th, 1789. That's the bicentennial moment.
Bicentennial or not, the junior class doesn't feel bound to the agreement of their seniors. At a most solemn moment, the juniors deliver a pizza, apparently because Mortimer Adler is known for what he eats as well as for what he thinks.
I am sorry that I have to tell you that most Americans who hold the high office of citizenship, the highest office in the land, for it's the primary office that any other office holder must have first of all, do not understand their role as citizens and are not prepared to be citizens. The kind of schooling we now give them does not prepare them for that, as I can tell you by having gone around the country and tried to read these documents. The three documents that constitute what I would call America's Testament: the Declaration, the Constitution with the preamble and its amendments, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and add to that perhaps the Federalist Papers and de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. These are not read by any of our high schools or elementary schools. They're not read in most of our colleges. And when they are read, as I found out, they are not understood at all. Now, in what sense can we regard these young people going into the high office of citizenship as able to carry out the mandate that they should have as the ruling class in this country? I would say, in closing, that unless we radically reform the school system of the United States, radically reform it, teach the young how to read these documents and have them read them, unless we somehow prepare them for citizenship as they're not prepared now, the future of this country, both politically and economically, is seriously in question. Thank you.
You said in there you found no high school students of late who've read the Constitution, the Declaration?
Not one in 100,000 has read these documents. And when I read them with them, they don't understand a word of them. Don't understand a word of them.
If you go to Washington, you'll find the Constitution encased there in almost like a sacred relic.
I know.
Do we treat it with too much reverence?
We treat it the way Christians say the Lord's Prayer without understanding it. They mouth words. We bow to it, but don't understand it. I think it's the most, I mean, if religious Christians, according to our Puritan ancestors, should spend the Sabbath reading the Holy Writ and going to church and worshiping God, citizens should read Holy Writ, the American Testament, the secular Testament, which is the Constitution, the Declaration, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and understand it.
They're calling you.
Sometime I will give that lecture, St. John.
Here in the Great Hall, where the dancing once attracted heroes of the American Revolution like General Lafayette, the celebration these days is an intellectual exploration of the American experience under our Constitution.
What aspect of the Constitution is most commonly misunderstood? You said through your visits.
I said not understood, not misunderstood. The young people at various levels of schooling with whom I've read the preamble, very short document, or that second great paragraph of the Declaration, do not know what the word truth means. You say, I ask them if they ever told a lie, and they always say yes, I've told a lie. That's well, how do you tell a lie? And what is a lie when you tell one? They don't know the answer to that question. If they don't know the answer to that question, they can't say what anything is true or false. Self-evident they don't know. I say, have you taken a course in geometry? They all say they have. In fact, their language is as follows. I had geometry. That means don't dare ask me a question about it. I had it. I passed the examination. That's done with. And therefore, you can't say, what is an axiom? What is a postulate? What's a theorem? What's the difference between a provable and unprovable proposition? Not one student in a million can tell you what equal and unequal means. So how can they read these documents? They aren't taught to read that way. It is, I think it's a frightening failure of our country to allow young people to grow up in that degree of, shall I say, untrained, undisciplined minds, that they can't read these documents, which are the very heart and soul of this country.
Mortimer Adler expects his students of every age to grasp the core of the American experience, ideas embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution. Text he will discuss with this select group of St. John students in a special seminar. He traces these ideals, justice and union, domestic tranquility and the common defense, liberty and the general welfare, in his own most recent book.
In the laws, Plato says that every basic law, and certainly the Constitution is the fundamental law of the land, should have a preamble. Let me tell you something you may not know. Only in the last 48 hours, just before the Constitution was given to the public, sent to New York to the Congress, did anyone think of writing a preamble? Do you think that the preamble was an afterthought among our founding fathers? What would you say?
Ideals.
Ideals, the objectives.
Yeah, the objectives of
well, don't you think it's odd that if you were writing a Constitution to serve some objectives, don't you think you ought to state the objectives first and then draft the Constitution as an instrument for serving those objectives? They drafted at the very end, didn't they?
I don't think that that's necessarily unnatural, because they would have these ideals in their head, and
you think Governor Morris merely put on paper the ideals they all had been in their heads, even though
they were. I think they all knew that what had to be ensured by the Constitution.
Ms. Sennett?
I think they must have had their purpose in mind before.
Their purposes in the plural,
Their
right?
purposes, yes.
Yeah.
So if the Constitution itself is the framework that everything falls into, this is the setting out that states what the framework is
That
intended to
phrasing
do.
of the preamble, we, the people of the United States, in order to do this, do this, do this, do this, do ordain this Constitution. That is an extraordinary statement of what we're doing it for. And the Constitution really provides the instrumentalities for doing it, correct?
Most people never quote the preamble. Supreme Court justices, lawyers.
It's hardly a consideration in ordinary constitutional law. But, and I have to add something that I think is very important, actually the preamble was written at the very last moment, the last 48 hours, by Governor Morris.
Why?
Well, I think without it, the document would be a body without a head. This is the head of the body. It really says what they're doing. They're establishing the Constitution of the United States of America for these reasons and for these purposes. Just how would it read without it? Moreover, I would go further, Bill, and I'd say that to look at the Constitution without this is not to see what it's all about. These are the ideals, the objectives, the goals that the government is created to serve. The articles of the Constitution have no ideas and ideals in them. The articles are merely the machinery of government to serve these purposes. And
in other words, the preamble breathes life into the rule book.
Yeah, that's right. It is the spirit of the thing. Without it, it's I say, a headless body. Let me add one other thing, Bill. The United States is the only country in which the officers of government, everyone holds a political office in the federal government, and all officers of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Force swear their allegiance to the Constitution to defend and uphold it. Not their allegiance to the king, not their allegiance to the state, not their loyalty to any other person, and not even to the nation, but to the Constitution. Now, that's how strong this country is in its devotion to the Constitution.
But it's really more, is it not, than to this document, this rule book?
I think it should be to the ideals that the Constitution stands for. That's why the preamble is so important.
But look at some of those words. We, the people.
Let me comment on that for a moment. Stop right there. Every other law, except the Constitution, is not made by the people, by the legislature. This law is made by the people of the United States, I mean the representatives, and resubmitted to them for ratification and adoption. a constitutional law does not proceed from a legislature because, after all, Article 1 of the Constitution creates the legislature. Therefore, it is not, the Constitution itself is not a legislative enactment. It's an enactment by the people of the country.
And yet that's the catch, because the Constitution, as it was finally written and adopted, excluded the young because of their age, women because of their gender, blacks because of their color, white males who couldn't pay a poll tax, and only 5% of the people in the states ratified.
You're quite correct, but you see, the word people is not synonymous with population. The people are that part of the people. The word people politically means that part of the population who have the status that enables them to act politically until the suffrage is extended to blacks, to women, to the poor, the people. Until this century, the people of the United States, as opposed to the population of the United States, was a small fraction of the population. When a government is tyrannical, it is obviously, the word tyranny has the connotation of injustice for you, doesn't it? Yeah. Tyranny is an injustice. Those who are tyrannically ruled are unjustly treated, correct? Well, Madison, James Madison, in the 10th Federalist paper, which you've all read, is very much concerned, as Tocqueville was also, as John Stuart Mill was later, about in a Republican government, a constitutional government, where the principle of majority rule prevails, that the majority, not just merely a despot, can be tyrannical, but the majority can be tyrannical and misrule an adversely treated minority, correct? Do you know anything about our constitutional government that tells you how we manage to, shall I say, correct, overcome the tyranny of the majority?
The judiciary.
Tell me about that, please.
In setting it separate from the legislative and executive branch to a certain degree, it has the responsibility of judging laws that are enacted.
The power of judicial review.
Right, and to see if they are
in
accord with the Constitution.
Is that power in the as you read the third article, does it say that the Supreme Court shall have the power to review legislative and executive acts and declare them unconstitutional if unjust?
No, it doesn't.
How did it happen then?
This is a thing that developed over time with...
But it is essentially, even though unwritten, not in the writing of the Constitution, it is an essential part of our government, is it not?
It is. It's what keeps the majority not becoming a tyrant.
For example, in England, which is a constitutional government too, an act of parliament, which may be unjust because there's a tyrannical majority mistreating a minority in England, can only be changed by another act of parliament. There is no device anything like our Supreme Court's judicial review of legislation in England. And therefore, there's no way to overcome the tyranny of the majority in England except by the majority itself changing its mind.
Federal judges are appointed and Supreme Court justices are appointed by a president, and it doesn't seem as though the mechanism itself necessarily protects us, because it could become a political instrument in the case of judges.
No one claims it's a perfect system. The question is it a better system than any other that exists? And I think that is there I would not hesitate affirmatively. Not to have judicial review, I think, is no protection against the tyranny of the majority. To have it gives us some protection. Not that it always works perfectly.
Mr. Adler, can I connect something with what Mr. Swade is
Yes.
saying? And I think this has to be pressed, although it hasn't been mentioned. Redress of grievances in this country to the Supreme Court is a very long and complicated process. And for some reason, maybe if there's some way that redress of grievances is not so long and complicated. I mean, I feel that has a lot to do with the political sense of redress. I'm not arguing, the Supreme Court is a great mechanism for redress of grievances, but it is so long and so complicated, and that's part of that could be construed
But even
as part of the
longer
material.
is appeal to the public majority to change the color of Congress. That would take longer even still, you see. But you're thoroughly right, though, Mr. Alton, on this point. The civil peace, the thing that is at the very heart of civil domestic tranquility, is the ability of the people of the United States to try to redress their grievances without resort to violence. Means of civil dissent, means of appeal to legislation. I mean, in fact, Theodore Roosevelt proposed that our Constitution contain the amendments of referendum, initiative, and recall to give the people even more access to means for addressing their grievances.
Right, and more access is what we need right now. It's a very long and complicated process to take a case all the way to the Supreme Court, as I think Mr. Smith.
Yes, please, Mr.
Ms. Dalton, I mean,
Yes,
the fact that it takes so long is an attribute, because think of how many cases there would be in the Supreme Court if they didn't have that weeding out process. If they didn't have these courts that said, well, we're going to decide this right now, or we're going to decide that this is not something to be considered.
They don't take most of the cases that come before them.
Right.
Look at civil courts now. Look at them today.
I have a feeling it lends itself to more violence
The ideal,
rather than
the ideal
less.
you're stating is, whenever the people feel they have a real grievance, you want them to have a civil means of dissent, a lawful ways of getting their grievances redressed rapidly. That's the ideal, isn't it? As rapidly as possible.
Just so that it doesn't break out into violence.
Mr. Adler?
Pardon me? Yes?
Don't you think it might be better if the people had some kind of means of recall on the justices?
See, that's the problem, is that if you enter into that problem, then you're getting this problem of being too political. And already there are signs, you know, that politics is influencing. And if you have some means of redress with the Supreme Court, you might get into the fact that then they have to make majority political decisions. Instead, when you give them life, it gives them that distance from the people that I think you're referring to.
But don't we say that justice is based on the consent of the people?
No. Never. Justice is something quite separate from the consent of the people.
Well, see, I don't see what the difference is. I don't see how the justice can't uphold a tyranny of the minority.
I don't think there's any possibility in a constitutional government of having tyranny of the minority, because we pass all our legislation by a majority vote. So the whole problem is the tyranny of the majority, not the tyranny of the minority. How do those unjust laws get corrected? That is the problem. Overcoming or correcting the tyranny of legislation by a majority that treats a minority of the people unjustly.
Well, there's a problem.
What's the problem?
This problem, when this Constitution was set up, in the first article, we have an enunciation of who is counted when we get representation. And you notice it's a very selective count. We have property holders later on. We only have white males that end up being property holders at that time. So it is possible to get a tyranny of the minority due to the fact that there are so many people who are disfranchised.
But Ms. Dalton, you do recognize, don't you, that in the course of the 200 years, the amendments to the Constitution have removed the very thing you're talking about. I mean, that's what, I'm sorry, you have to remember, we corrected those defects in the Constitution by the Civil War amendments, by the Women's Suffrage Amendment. The progress this country has made from the 18th to the 20th century is the emergence of democracy. It didn't happen all at once. So
And they didn't pretend to have a democratic constitution then.
But
in fact, they were
assuming that-
against democracy. They were explicitly against democracy.
Right.
I have to clear up a confusion here. We use two phrases and you haven't got clear what they mean. The tyranny of the majority means a majority in the legislature. The tyranny of the minority occurred when, you're quite correct, the ruling class, the citizens, who were a small fraction of the population, could be tyrannical. That could be a tyrannical minority, but that's a different point. Just keep it clearly distinct from the other meaning of a tyranny of a legislative majority. Those are two different things, and we've corrected both. If this document were not amended with the first 10 amendments and with all the amendments that followed, and existed today only as it was written and adopted in 1787, 88, 89, I would not regard it with reverence. I would fight it.
Why?
Because it's unjust. Because it's intrinsically, perfectly obviously unjust. Think of all the amendments that made it just.
So it's the American experience, the struggle for democracy, the constantly widening of the horizons of equality that have breathed into this document the experience that followed it.
And you have to say that our founding fathers allowed for that. I have a quotation here that I want to read you from Madison, who was one of the more conservative writers of the Constitution.
And
He
who is really considered the architect of the Constitution.
This is in 1819. It could not but happen, and was foreseen at the birth of the Constitution, that difficulties and differences of opinion might occasionally arise in expounding terms and phrases necessarily used in such a charter, and that it might require a regular course of practice to liquidate and settle the meaning of some of them. I mean, he was conscious of the fact that judicial interpretation and amendment would have to take place.
It bothers me when young people, anyone, but young people in particular, think it's all over when they take for granted this document, when they don't realize every generation struggles to put its own meaning into the Constitution.
Well, if you and I are right about this, that means the document has not only a past and a development, but a future. To take the document, even now, with all the amendments that have been added, as the finished thing is wrong.
It seems to me that the genius of the document and the system is that it provides for a means of settling our disputes without resort to violence.
No question about that.
Even while we are changing radically
Absolutely.
the document by which we live.
Absolutely. It is an extraordinary method of providing for lawful political change. It is said of Jefferson that he recommended that we have a revolution every second or third generation. We don't have to have it. Every one of these amendments is a revolution. Every one of the amendments has changed the course of life in this country. I mean, turn it around.
Mortimer, why do you think our ancestors felt they were justified in limiting suffrage to white males who were owners of property?
The proposition that all men are created equal, or in my version, in order to avoid the theological implications of the word created, the proposition that all men are by nature equal was not accepted. Jefferson wrote those words, and Lincoln interpreted those words to be a pledge to the future, not a description of the way men thought at the time. In the 18th century, the prevailing prejudices were against human equality. The males thought they were superior to the females. The whites thought they were superior to the blacks. The rich thought they were superior to the poor. You have to come down to the first quarter of the 20th, a little beyond the first quarter of the 20th century to get democracy in existence. Meaning by that, only for one moment now, universal suffrage. And a democracy is constitutional government with universal suffrage, and I'd go something further, and securing all human rights, both political and economic. When I add that last clause, we don't have democracy yet fully in this country. Talk about happiness now as a whole good life well lived. That's an end. The means to pursuing it are being alive, being free, having certain economic goods, having certain other of your human needs fulfilled. Then it seems to me what we're saying is you have a right to all the things you need in order to pursue happiness. But some of the things you need virtue as well, moral virtue, but that you get yourself. You don't need government to give you moral virtue. But all the other things that you need to pursue happiness can be within the power of government to help you get,
See,
right?
a question, okay, and we differ here then. I agree that you need freedom and that you need life to pursue happiness, but I don't think it's the place of government to go about handing out economic.
Why not?
Because who decides, right? Who decides what a decent living is, what unfair competition is, a decent home, good health, adequate protection, good education?
You do understand how human beings can be deprived of the essentials of living even. When Monsignor Ryan, in that famous book of his, The Right to a Living Wage, explained that a living wage was the condition of a decent livelihood, he was talking about the line between those who are simply have-nots, have not the things that any human being needs. Now, above that line, there are all kinds of shades of gray.
Sure.
But there is a line deriving the haves and the have-nots, would you say?
My question then is how far, once you begin to legislate these things, how far are you willing to take it?
I admit it's difficult. I mean, we're struggling with it. We haven't solved it yet. I'm only saying, must we not face it?
Oh, it's certainly something that must be dealt with.
That's all I'm saying.
We're facing it.
I think.
Pardon me?
We're trying to face
Yes,
it right
we are.
now.
But our forefathers did not. I don't think our founding fathers, no fault of theirs, no one anywhere in the 18th century or much of the 19th even thought of economic rights. That's the 20th century. That's an extraordinary advance in the 20th century.
Isn't possibly one of the
something?
reasons, if you argue for economic rights and you say that the have-nots have to be somehow
taken care of
by the haves, isn't that an infringement?
By the state.
Well, then you're going to have more taxation for the.
Yes.
Isn't that infringement on the individual rights?
No.
Of.
After all, we invented income taxes in the 20th century. We invented
But
inheritance
taxation in the Constitution is solely for the maintenance of the state.
Yeah, but we changed that in the 20th century. The main purpose of taxation originally was to support the services of government. We have gone beyond that. In fact, when you think of the large portion of the federal budget that is now spent on the one hand for the common defense, on the other hand for the entitlement programs, you see we're using the tax money to redistribute wealth.
So you would...
We are doing that now, aren't we?
But is that,
we're doing that. We are doing it, aren't we?
We are, but I'm saying, I guess if you interpret the Constitution as providing a grounds for that, there seems to be ultimately individuals whose rights seem somehow infringed upon. When you demand of a person money to support another citizen instead of to support the government which supports him.
The rights of property are not inviolable. If the common good, they can be invaded if the common good must be served.
Would you disagree then, Mr. Adler, with the proposition that government governs best, which governs least?
I think Jefferson was wrong in saying that government governs best, which governs least. I think the opposite opinion is equally wrong, that government governs best, which governs most. I think the only true statement is that government governs best, which governs most justly, which secures all human rights, both political and economic.
See, I'm not sure that's within the realm of government to do.
It isn't? To govern justly?
See, you're talking about securing all human rights, and there are some things that I don't think can be legislated.
Doesn't the Declaration say that government should be instituted to secure these rights? Now, the only question is what these rights are. But it's securing these rights, these human rights. Now, the only question is, do human rights include economic rights as well as political rights? I say yes to that. Some people say no. But if our human rights are both economic and political, and a just government secures all human rights, it should secure economic as well as political.
If human rights, if you include economic, if you think of economic goods as rights, then of course it belongs.
Would you tell me why you? But just give me one more moment. Would you tell me why you don't include economic goods as rights?
I believe in equality of opportunity.
I do too.
That everyone should have the opportunity to make the best of what
they
have.
But I also believe, in addition to equality of opportunity, in equality of conditions, which is so hopeful.
Living
you read
conditions.
Tocqueville, didn't you?
Sure.
And Tocqueville says democracy in the broad sense, consists in a universal equality of conditions. That means political conditions and economic conditions.
Yeah, see, I don't think that the framers of the Constitution intended to go nearly
I agree
that
with
far.
you, but I didn't say the framers did. I'm saying in the long 200-year period in which this Constitution has evolved and developed, we have changed from what the framers had in mind, no question about it.
Okay.
Otherwise, there wouldn't be any amendments.
Then that is a change. I don't approve of that.
You don't approve that
direction
change.
of change.
You'd like to stick to the 18th century notion of just political rights, would you?
Now don't go
Well,
making me say things that I don't mean, right? I'm not.
You just said that a moment ago.
Well, I didn't really.
I'd let you take it back. Go ahead. What do you want to say now?
Okay, I'm certainly not in favor of things of the way labor conditions were and what was necessary in the 18th century. I do.
You think we've improved on that?
I think we've improved on that. Yeah, I think that's a positive change.
Well, you might posit that the way isn't through the Constitution to do that thing. It's more social, and it may be in the labor unions and that. Is that what you?
In fact, in the 20th century, so far in the 20th century, the motion toward the recognition of economic rights, and I'm going to sum them all up by saying the right to a decent livelihood. All human beings have that right secured if they're going to lead decent human lives, that we've done that by positive legislation, not by constitutional amendments. Lincoln said the government should do for the people only what the people, individually and collectively, cannot do for themselves. If the people collectively or individually could do this by themselves, you wouldn't have the government doing it. When they don't do it by themselves, then the government steps in and does it.
Well, he also says, when he's talking to the Cooper Union, he says the way to that sort of freedom that you're talking about, economic freedom, is through industrialization.
That's right.
Not through welfare programs.
That's in the 1860s. Things have changed since then.
Right, but I still think that in some way the welfare state's at odds to individual liberties.
Well, do you suggest
individual rights?
How?
The rights of property of those who are being taxed for the economic
But
rights
if the
of
government
others.
doesn't ensure domestic tranquility and if we say the peasants revolt,
Well,
you're
I'm
going to
not-
have a problem. I mean, there are people of us here that wouldn't be here if it wasn't for government financial programs.
Right. But
I would not be sitting at this table.
There are statesmen who are saying, who are pushing for education and industrialization.
You think the income tax is unjust? That's an invasion of property. I'm taking your property away. I'm taxing you not for the services of government. Believe me, the income tax and the inheritance tax is a redistributive tax. Do you think it's unjust?
I'm not sure, but I know people who do.
I would say
I don't
it's
really
not
have an
unjust.
opinion of that.
That we hold our property under the limitation that we must serve the common good in holding it.
So you're saying that we exist for the state?
That's right. No, I'm not saying, I'm hardly saying that. I'm saying our property is not entirely free at our disposal.
Sure, we need to maintain the government. I mean, I can't take issue with that.
Not only
It's just
maintain
that-
the government, but serve the common good.
See, it's the implementation, it's what some of that tax money is being used for. The taxes are necessary to maintain the government
And
is
more than
true.
that, to serve the general welfare, promote the general welfare.
Okay, and are we diverge in how we think the general welfare should be served?
Well, the only question is, I mean, I'm going to leave it at this because but I want you to think about it. If we tax to promote the general welfare, and if the general welfare is fundamentally economic in character, or certainly involves economic matter, then it's perfectly all right to tax in order to promote the economic welfare of the people of this country. That there shall be no economic have-nots in serious deprivation.
So how well do you think the Constitution is serving those ideals of the preamble? Established justice.
Well, let's see, I think it has done well about securing the blessings of liberty for, I mean, not perfectly ever, but I'd say that it does very well. I think it has done pretty well with respect to ensuring domestic tranquility. We spent a lot of money, and I think we're doing pretty well on promoting the common defense. I think we're doing very much better than we ever did in the past on the general welfare. Justice, I think, is still not well enough done, because I think, I may be alone in thinking this, but I think that economic rights are just as basically human rights as political rights, and we haven't fully and finally secured them by civil enactments.
And the founders were hardly concerned at all with economic rights.
I had no thought of it. If you had asked them about it, they would have said they didn't exist.
But where do you find in the Constitution the wellspring for economic rights? I can see the political...
It is not in the Constitution. It is not in the... Unless it is there implicitly in the General Welfare Clause.
Section 8...
No, not in the... but in the preamble. Oh, no. By interpreting the preamble to mean, if I read the preamble to promote the general, parenthesis, economic welfare, then they would be there. And I would say that my reading of the preamble is such that I think no proper meaning can be given to the phrase general welfare without adding the word economic. Otherwise, it's redundant, overlaps the other things. The general welfare includes all the others if you don't make it narrowly economic.
But the response from people is going to be that the Constitution is about political rights, the nature of government, the nature of citizenship, not economic rights or the need of consumers.
Section 8 of Article 1 is economic as well as political. Many things are. And secondly, in the 20th century, we have become a welfare state with welfare legislation, and I think that's the proper interpretation of the General Welfare Clause. We are promoting the general welfare in the 20th century as we never did in the 19th and 18th.
What about that phrase in the preamble to provide for the common defense? What do you think was in the minds of the framers when they talked about a standing army?
Oh, they meant a standing army, a small navy, a small standing army. They had no vision at all of the kind of world in which we live, in which the notion of an aerial assault upon our dominions, our domain is inconceivable to them.
What was it Madison said? The liberties of Rome proved the final victim to her military triumphs. Right. They were afraid of a large army, were not they? Very skeptical of it.
As a matter of fact, one of the crucial things is making the president a civilian, the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. I mean, in this country, in no European country at the time, was the kind of civilian control of the military in existence.
Look at our present military establishment, huge in size and arsenal, globally dispersed, biting deep into the nation's budget, thoroughly embedded into the industrial, technological side of our society, cloaked in secrecy so often, and deeply affecting both domestic and foreign affairs. Do the precautions written into that Constitution by those founding fathers prevail today?
No. The Constitution, I think, provides for an adequate handling of the issues and problems of domestic policy. It provided for the operation of foreign policy in a world totally different from ours, with a small army and navy, and no need for secret diplomacy. In fact, obviously, diplomats our ambassadors had to act on their own. They couldn't act on instructions from Washington. There was no way to do that. I think the Constitution is totally inadequate in the field of foreign policy for the world we live in today.
Foreign policy, including the defense establishment.
Not just the defense, the CIA,
yeah.
the National Security Council.
This huge octopus.
Yes. By the way, Congress declared the First World War, and Congress declared the Second World War. Congress did not declare the war in Korea. Congress did not declare the war in Vietnam. Right about both those things?
That's right.
We have deviated that after the Second World War, that our operations in foreign policy have become more and more unconstitutional or non-constitutional.
Non-constitutional. Yeah. Beyond the Constitution.
Unprepared for by the Constitution. Outside the scope of the Constitution.
So are we sort of out there in dark waters?
Yes. I think it's I can't think of any more serious problem. The two most serious problems about this Constitution, as far as is one, to so change it that it adequately controls the operation of foreign policy in a world in which secrecy and various quick decisions have to be made that Congress can't make. I don't know how to do that. But you don't want to weaken us in relation to adversaries that are not under the restraints of constitutional government.
No, but I suggest that we are more weakened by an executive branch out of control, operating in the dark, fighting wars with private armies in Central America and Africa and other places than we are from whatever someone else can do to us.
The two problems, one is in the field of foreign policy, other is, I think, making democracy itself more secure. See, if I'm correct in saying that democracy is an infant, a fragile, feeble infant born in the last 50 years, we have a long way to go to make that a strong, sturdy adult. Democracy is very recent indeed. See, again, I hope I am not vilifying or criticizing my fellow Americans, but I think if you told a large number of Americans what constitutional democracy consisted in, they would not be for it.
It would be?
It would be too radical for them. There was a time 10 years ago when people in San Francisco were shown the Declaration of Independence and asked whether they would sign it, and they said no.
Even though the ideal of democracy and the word democracy do not appear in the preamble of the Constitution, we have a system in which democracy has emerged and has been spread ever more widely. And yet, Mortimer, it's only come, every step of the way was bitterly contested by the powers that be.
And I think every step in the way ahead
toward economic equality?
To improve democracy. I think there are many things, in fact, in the last chapter of this book, I made a list of questions. I didn't answer them. Questions about what might have to be done to make democratic government work more perfectly than it does now. I think it's not working perfectly. I think our citizens are not prepared to be citizens. I think the government has many hitches and failings that prevent it from operating democratically. There are 3-4 ways in which this present document as it now stands can be changed. 1, by further amendments. 2, by congressional legislation. 3, by radical new interpretations on the part of the Supreme Court, which have happened again and again. And 4, the one I most fear and disapprove of or dislike, is calling a second constitutional convention, because I don't think we have the statesmen they had. I don't think with our large population we have the statesmen they had with the small population in 1787.
So you think that a second constitutional convention would be chaos?
I think so. In addition to which, that constitutional convention occurred for several months with not one word leaking out, no TV cameras, no press, no public discussion. Not a thing happened until the document was completed and drafted and submitted to the people for their consideration.
Madison would not even let his notes of the convention be published until after his death.
Washington sat in the dais, chairman of the convention, never opened his mouth except on one occasion when one member carelessly dropped his notes in a tavern, and he publicly rebuked that member for breaching the secrecy of the convention.
So we couldn't do that on the 6 o'clock evening news?
No, we could not do it on the
7 o'clock news.
Right. Let's go on to the last of the clauses in the preamble. We're covering the preamble very well. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The question is, are we correct in saying that one should be free to do anything one pleases in the realm of one's private conduct, where private means the actions taken, the freedom exercised, does not injure anybody else or the common good? And that the law should regulate limit our freedom by positive regulation only when our actions either do or threaten to do the following: injure others or detract from the common good. If you all agree to that, by the way? If you do, how does one draw the line between the private and the public? Remember last evening, I quoted St. Thomas on a very crucial matter, that civil legislation should not attempt to promote all virtues, all virtuous acts, and prohibit all vicious acts. It should only invade the field of morality only insofar as the conduct affects others.
For example, murder?
Murder, yes, it obviously affects others.
What about if there's... It's a moral question, and so...
What about suicide? I think
Well,
suicide
that's
is
very different. Suicide's a very interesting case, you see. Suicide is regarded as a sin, but whether or not that sin should be prohibited by civil law is a very serious question. I think it should not be. Now, suicide is a Christian sin because it's a sin against God, not against the state.
It's a sin against the state, too,
No, it
in a
isn't.
way.
There are no sins. All sins
But-
are.
but
There are
I'm
no
not
sins
saying
against the
it's
state.
metaphorical, but
All
it-
sins
it
against.
is-
Let's
it is
suppose for
wrong
the moment.
for the
Let's suppose for the moment that suicide is a religiously prohibited act. Should the state also prohibit it is another question.
No, the last sentence of Article 6 in the Constitution, and also
Says?
the first sentence of the First Amendment, says that it shouldn't be
Well,
religious.
That's precisely the point. In other words, I think it is wrong to legislate any moral act, shall I say, command a moral act or prohibit an immoral act if that moral act and immoral act do not affect others of the common good.
Less than that, why can't I drink before I'm 21?
Answer your own question. Do you think the legislation that, shall I say, limits the consumption of alcohol to those who have reached the age of consent or some other age is unjust law? And if so, why?
Well, I don't think that's to my point. I think to my point would be to ask, is that a moral law? And it seems that the legislature has determined that there's something within me that cannot.
Statistics, drunk driving.
It's not a matter of
Statistics
moral
are-
law, it's a matter of common law, of common good. And you cannot make laws based on moral law, because you have to distinguish between common good, what's good for all men, and what is good for one man and not for another. And that is where morality begins to have its
So
effect.
understand where the problem lies. Take, for instance, some fundamentalists.
Yes.
Some laws that we would call moral, to them, they're going to argue, and I don't agree with this, but they're going to argue that those laws aren't questions of morality,
But are the
that
common
certain
good.
things endanger their children, and that they are protecting the common good, that by banning certain books, which is, in my opinion, something that should never be done, but they're going to say it's something that endangers their children, the mere existence of these books in a society.
Yeah.
So there's a problem.
It's the great problem, I think, first raised by John Stuart Mill in his great essay on liberty, about the line to be drawn between conduct and liberty in the sphere of conduct, which is strictly private, where private means affects me and me alone and injures no one else and in no way detracts from the common public good.
And you would include sexual acts performed in private by
Right.
consenting adults.
Right. I would include all acts that have no victims. The phrase is crimes without, there can't be any crimes without victims. A true crime must have a victim. Acts that have no victims are not crimes. We have made criminal many acts that have no victims.
Many people consider them sinful or unvirtuous.
They are there. I have no quarrel with them on that. There are many sinful acts, many unvirtuous acts, many immoral acts that cannot be legislatively prohibited.
You mean there are some places that, by church doctrine, are sinful where the state cannot go and say this
Should
is
not
wrong?
go.
The
Should
state
not
can't
go.
say thou
That's
shalt
right.
not.
The church can say it, and a moral counselor can say that's an immoral act, don't do it, but it cannot be prohibited by law, because civil law, the law of the state, must regulate human conduct only insofar as that conduct affects the public interest. You've read the Meno, haven't you? And in the Meno, Plato, I think, more clearly than anybody else, shows why no one can, shall I say, form the moral character of anybody else. The conclusion of the Mino is that virtue cannot be taught, cannot be instilled.
Right, but you can
If
be
that's the
raised.
case, but hold it. If that's the case, then government can't do it, obviously, any more than teachers can, any more than parents can. All I'm saying is the law of the state, civil law, should go no further in regulating human conduct, even in the sphere of morality or of sin and vice, beyond what affects the good of others.
That's not really simple, is it? It seems as if we have that line again between where we call something moral and where we decide that it has to do with the common good. Because, I mean, with Mr. Virgil's example of drinking, we can argue that it's dangerous to the community because people under 21 tend to drink and drive.
Well,
in the case of smoking, we can say that secondary smoke is dangerous to others, therefore it affects people.
Yes.
So I still think that it's difficult to draw a line between the moral or, you know, our moral attitude which affects no one else and maybe a moral attitude which does affect others.
Especially because the moral law and to a certain extent the common law, if you need the arena of conflict and choice, if you deprive people of their choice by regulating everything that's good for them, how do they have the liberty of mind to cultivate true moral virtue?
See, you're all on the point, and we haven't advanced any because we've all been really saying the same thing. We recognize what the sphere of moral conduct is. We recognize the importance of virtue in human life, leading a good life. And the main point still is, if there must be a way of drawing the line between those of our acts which are truly private, moral or immoral, but truly private in the sense that they affect no one else, nor the common good of the community. In that sphere of action, no government regulation or law should be made.
The state has no basis regulating private morality?
Not at all, not the least.
Who does?
The church, moral preceptors, but not the state. The state is concerned with the good of individuals and the common good as affected by the actions of others.
Isn't it the consensus of society that decides what is right and wrong, that decides the moral standards?
I'm not denying that sodomy is wrong. I'm not denying that rape is wrong, and that the difference between sodomy and rape is that rape is injury to a non-consenting person.
So it's a crime?
Crime, yes. Any sexual act between consenting persons can't be a crime because no one's injured.
You say in the opening of We Hold These Truths that the citizens of this country, young and old, have misconceived the role of the citizen in America.
I think there's no question about that.
How is that? What do you mean?
Well, I mean by that most Americans, young and old, think of the government as existing in the persons who occupy offices in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere in the federal government's office buildings. That is not the government. We, the people, the citizens of a constitutional government, whether it be a democracy or not, whoever the citizens, are the ruling class. As Lincoln said, the office holders are the servants of the people. The people, the citizens, are the permanent and primary rulers, principal rulers. The office holders are the transient and instrumental rulers. They rule as our representatives.
What would we do differently if we acted this way?
I think we would be more responsible. We think we perform our duties as citizens. Most of us don't even do that. A large number of people don't even go to the polls on election day. I would like to suggest that just as every true Christian, I take Christianity merely as an example, should spend some portion of his time every week in reading Holy Scripture and contemplating God, put it that way, so every citizen should spend some portion of his time every week reading the secular testament, which are these documents, which is our political sacred scripture, and contemplating the Constitution and I'd almost say, it's not only the President of the United States who should take an oath of loyalty to the Constitution to pledge himself to defend and uphold it. Every citizen should do that once a week. Once a week, and reminded of what his duties as a citizen are. But he only can do that if he understands all this, as they don't understand it now.
It's a big task.
I know. I don't have any hope for the present generation. I'm hoping for the future. I'm hoping that we can change the schools, at least in this respect, that we do something that really turns out in the next generation and after that, young men and women who understand not only the ideas and ideals, but I feel the moral obligation to uphold them.
But if we do understand them, will that increase the world's stock of justice?
Yes, I think, let me put it this way. If the young really understood those two propositions about all men being by nature equal, and by nature, inherent in the nature are certain unalienable human rights, and that justice consists in securing those rights and treating equals equally, I think the next generation might be inclined to do justice more than the last generation. Yes, I do believe that.